there's a tremendous amount to talk about, so I'm going to try to keep the pleasantries to a minimum so we can spend the most time as possible with our distinguished panel. What I want to do in terms of the organization is as follows. Just briefly introduce everybody up here and just have them say their names, and then what we'll do is I'll ask each panelist to come up and spend a very few minutes just giving us a brief snapshot of the Making Space or program that they're working with, so everybody has a sense of the different flavors and can contextualize it. And once we do that, then everybody will sit back down, and then we're going to walk through these three key issues that we think are pervasive across these spaces and hopefully interesting to all of you as well. They are the tension between instruction and self-direction, how that's balanced, looking at the art and engineering boundary, and then finally, which I think is kind of the meatiest and probably the most time-consuming, trying to ask the question, what are these developing qualities or capacities that are happening, whether they're in individuals, in groups, or communities that are going on in these spaces, and how do we assess or document them, trying to get closer to some sense of the research framing. And then also, along the way, how do we contrast what's happening in these spaces with what we think of as maybe more traditional STEM environment. So with that, I'll stop and just briefly, just let me introduce who's on the panel. So to my right, your left is Reed Stevens from Northwestern University, my colleague on the FUSE program here in Chicago. Leela Lyons, UIC/New York Hall of Science. Matthew Berlin, now at University of Wisconsin. Brianne Britt, right? Brianne, also from Wisconsin. And finally, at the very, very end, Lisa from the Children's Museum. So, and everyone has multiple affiliations, so we'll stick with that. So, with that, let me turn it over, and we'll start with Reed to introduce us to this program.
Thanks, Tony. I'm here representing FUSE, which is a after-school project for high school-age youth that's going on in the area. Kemi and I are directing the project. Three of our lead people here in the room, also Amy, Lauren, and Maggie, who may have talked to them this morning, but they'll be here after as well. So FUSE is something that happens in some after-school programs in high schools, and in particular right now, quite a lot in libraries in Chicago and in other libraries, in particular in Evanston. This is a shot of one of the FUSE rooms in action on Saturday morning. And this is a shot of our website. Front page you see when kids log onto the site. The basic idea of FUSE is organized around the idea of challenges, and there are a whole range of challenges kids can get involved in, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. Just to give you a visual gallery of some of the things that the kids are involved in, here are some of the challenges kids active in them. This is an LED challenge. This is a making an application for a Motorola device challenge. This is a biomaterials challenge that we whimsically called Just Beat It. This is a robot obstacle course challenge. And this is a spaghetti structure challenge. And there's a whole bunch more as represented on the page before this. Kids encounter these challenges through instructions on a website. And this is an example of that website. You can see the challenges, the challenge description, the stuff that they need. And along the left, you can also see an activity feed, which is a common feature of websites of this kind now, where you can see what other people are doing, what challenges they're involved in. So kids document their own activities in this. They document the completion of challenges. What you're seeing right here is how three girls satisfied one of the challenges for the LED challenge, turning on three lights at the same time. Cleverly, instead of actually having them all turned on by one button, they used three different fingers to turn them all on one time. So here what I want to do is show you a little bit about what the underlying structure is of FUSE. And we've modeled FUSE after the experience people have and seem to benefit from playing video games. Our project's not about video games. It just uses the structure of video game play. So what happens is kids enter into one of many different levels that they choose. And what happens then is the early levels are easy. After they get going, the levels get successively harder. And that's what you're seeing on the screen, are the successive levels, and kids, to use the language of video games, level up. Now, a bit more about the structure. It's as many of the things associated with MacArthur's funding as ours is here. This is a very interest-driven experience, and what you see there pictured pictorially are 3 case studies from a pilot work in 2011. Different ways that kids entered the challenge sequences and navigated through them. So, to get a bit further into this, this is a diagram created by Lauren Penny, a PhD student who's working on the project. This is trying to capture, in one of our Fuse studios, the whole range of activities, time and space, we're calling these activity maps. And to zero in just a little bit, here's an activity map for one young lady, and what you see there pictured down in the lower left are a series of attempts and successful attempts in one of the challenge sequences, which is the Beat It challenge sequence. Over here is her returning many months later and making a successful attempt on the first challenge and an unsuccessful attempt on the second challenge. So with that, I'll only say what we're trying to do is to build these challenges up and out so that there's enough to keep the kids busy and active. And the way we're doing that is by forming partnerships with other organizations here in Chicago and elsewhere. And the idea is to take really cool existing educational materials, for example, like the Chicago Architecture Foundation has amazing project-based materials. We're fitting them into our challenge structure and then building more challenges. And the general idea is build challenges to bring more young people into this experience and build them up and up so they can actually make connections to STEM activity that professionals would recognize. So that's a quick version of Fuse.
Super. So next, Matthew will come up and share a little bit about his work and his project.
Hi, I'm Matthew Berlin from UW-Madison, and I'm going to be giving a very quick overview of some work we're doing. Actually, more interested, I'm going to tell you more about stuff that's coming up, a big project that I'm working on designing right now with Layla Lyons from UST and New York College of Science. But a lot of my work has been focused on how to get kids to build and think through hard problems in computational thinking and computer science and engineering, and specifically I've done a lot of work in connecting the virtual with the physical, and that's one of the things we're doing here, one of the things we're focusing on. So we've got this Makescape project where we're going to go, where we're working in the New York College of Science to ask the sort of fundamental question, can we use this museum exhibit, this interactive virtual / physical, where we've got kids building actual artifacts with LEDs and whatnot, and linking that up into a virtual space in which there's some sort of progressive narrative. And how can we structure the space and design the space so that we can use that narrative to enable more complex creation both virtually and physically in a relatively short time span. We're limited by the space of museum visiting. So we've got two of the examples right here. We've got the fishing hole where kids build LED lures and various LED gadgets to attract simulated fish in a simulated fish bowl. And there's a competitive aspect to it, building a better lure, building a different kind of lure, and also a bit of a cooperative as you work with other people in the same fish bowl. And then the Happy City is built on another project at New York College of Science that I'll show you in a moment, in which the visitors are building the structure of the city physically, and then linking up to a virtual city that sort of that works in a complex space that shows things like traffic patterns and energy use. And it allows us to test a much more cooperative here. There's no way to win a city. It's up to you guys. But in general, thinking about how that works in a cooperative space. So this builds upon some work that they've already been doing at New York College of Science, the Happy Cities project, which you'll see this stuff talked about in more detail by Layla this afternoon. But by getting kids to build these cities, these physical cities, and making in the space, you provide a context, right, for kids to engage, and you provide them a way to think about how complex their construction can be. And you also encourage people who don't normally think of themselves as electronics hobbyists to think about building these stores that they might want to build, and complexifying the stores that they want to build. So down here you see how these things will work. So with that, I'm going to sort of leave the stage and we'll take it up again during that.
Hey, you're up.
So we're here on behalf, my name is Brianna, this is Lisa. We're here on behalf of the Learning and Making Research Team, which is a collaboration between the University of Wisconsin-Madison, George Mason University, and the Children's Museum in Pittsburgh. I'm here from the University of Wisconsin, and this is here from the Children's Museum in Pittsburgh. We have 3 main research sites. The study is focused around looking at the learning that happens in makerspaces with an ethnographic approach, and moving that toward designing learning environments with particular learning goals while still conserving the ethos of a makerspace at the Children's Museum in Pittsburgh and other informal learning environments. So these are Mount Elliott, the Make Shop at the Children's Museum in Pittsburgh, and then Sector 67 Madison, Wisconsin are the 3 main research sites for this. Is these different sorts of learning groups. There's individual and sort of self-directed family. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Sure. Just that, the ways in which the different contexts, one is an adult context, one is a community context, and the other is really a family-oriented context. And so to think about the types of groupings that happen, where individuals drive an interest versus a family driving the interest, and the ways in which that translates through their experiences, their making experiences.
So I'm just going to show a video as an example of that, and then we can talk a little bit more about that after this next. Right now we need to know. Yeah, it's there. Perfect. What else? Today we're going to try to turn that. Show us how to hook it up.
Okay, so this one has 2 holes, and this one has 2 holes. You're going to go, let's see if you can hook it up. So the red, we can connect the reds together.
How about red to red?
There you go.
Then
So
you
you do black to black. So this sort of demonstrates what Lisa was talking about. We can talk about that more as a group. The second big thing that we've been looking at is this idea of digitizing physical making, because a lot of the making that happens in makerspaces and at Make Shop is more with physical, at least the makerspaces that we're working at currently, physical artifacts and less digital. So the big thing that we're going to be implementing in this project is a digital critique, sort of asynchronous critique program with a tool. I think we're looking at a tool that the University of Illinois is currently working on. They already have something set up for this, so that mentors can take a look at, for example, kids at the museum's work and give feedback on it. And then this is. And then the last tension that we've been working on is trying to get at. We come with heavily like an arts perspective, and trying to get at this tension between art and engineering is a really big issue, so that we're allowing kids to go both routes and not just one or the other. So one of the ways that we recently just started designing experiments around is through maker challenges, or what we're calling maker challenges. And this is an example of one that we did actually just last Friday at Sector 67. And I just want to note the way that the group approaches the task and what
Can we
they
make one thing, we can make multiple things together.
Yeah, and it would need to be something that would be beyond what I would do by myself at home.
Right.
So, to make it interesting.
Okay, so let's think of quotes. So,
So the task was for them to create flow. And this is how they ended up approaching that task. It is very engineering and something that we're still discussing and realized with this Maker Challenge is that the materials available to them is what resulted in a more engineering approach to this. And then we can talk about that.
Super. All right, so we just wanted to kind of run through and give everybody an overview so that you have a sort of a context to understand the subsequent discussion that we want to have. And so we want to spend the rest of the time together, which is about 45 minutes or so, which is good because I was worried about this part taking too long, but we did a good job of that. Of trying to address some of the kind of cross-cutting issues, the shared issues that we're all wrestling with as designers and researchers in this space. And so I guess the first one I'd like the panel to think about and talk about, and we saw different versions of this in the examples, is this design tension between instruction or structure of whatever sort it is, and this more sort of self-directed ethos that has become associated with the kind of very idea of a makerspace, and how you think about that, how it's arisen in your particular environments or your observations thereof, and then how you address that and what are the different trade-offs. So why don't we turn that over to the panel and see, Reed, you want to start?
Sure, I'd be happy to start. Certainly I see this as a major issue for us, and I think for any of us, it can't be at either end of the spectrum. There's no room where people aren't getting help from other people, and there's no room where people are doing it all on their own. I think Kemi used a word that I like to think is more useful for us, is about structure. What we described in Fuse is a certain way of allowing for self-direction, which is the choosing of challenge sequences and the choosing to leave them. And our goal is to be good designers and keep kids in them. But in terms of support, once kids select things, we want to be as supportive as we can, and that means humans in the room, and it means web resources, and continuing to provide resources. But I think what we're trying to do is balance the idea of self-direction with structure, and the video game metaphor is how we've chosen to approach that.
So,
Make sure you're here, Mike.
Well, so working in a museum context is a bit of a special challenge. You know, after school context, you have the luxury of time. People will return, people will come back. In a museum visit experience, mind you, and there are programs even within NYSCI where we're trying to set up more of a longitudinal return-based program around making. But in the context of a typical exhibition, you have a person once, and you have them for 5 to 10 minutes, which is a really large constraint to place on us as designers to come up with an experience that would allow people to exhibit any kind of independent exploration. And so that's why we hit upon the strategy of using motivating fantasy narratives, because one of the key concepts, to my mind at least, behind making and engineering writ large, is the ability to design for a particular context and to be able to iterate within that context. So get feedback on what we've built, see whether it works or not, and adjust. And if you can't get kids through at least one iterative cycle within your visit, you haven't really introduced them to making or engineering. And so that's what we've been struggling with, and we'll be starting our grant in June, so we'll let you know how it goes. But we're hoping that we're going to explore a couple of different ways of coming up with a fantasy narrative. As Matthew was saying, looking at competitive versus cooperative stories, looking at different kinds of physical constructions, to see which things can be manipulated into a form that can be used and tested within a time frame we're looking at. So that's how we're approaching it.
Is this working now? Yes. Okay. I think there is definitely this feature about design as being constraints on creativity, but also enabling further creativity. I mean, there's the Oulipo idea, right? Where if you have this constrained creative writing space, you can produce more creative writing. But for the way we're thinking about design is the way I design a lot of the environments that I work with. I try and think about design as enabling kids to be creative within special spaces in which they have a limited set of creative choices, but that they can explore those and go deeper on them. Because what I'm looking for is evidence and engagement engagement with complex learning. Blending that in some way with structured social context, right? So not just thinking about it as instruction versus self-direction, but instruction versus collaborative direction versus self-direction, where pushing up the collaborative direction and figuring out ways to enable and support people to work together, not just at the what are you working on, what am I working on, but literally sharing information that's vital to both of them, sharing pieces of what they're building together, sharing classes if they're coding together, this kind of thing, finding ways to blend structured social into the thing, and then also obviously providing guidance and information and facilitation as needed, but trying to make sure that the space is designed and constrained in such a way that we believe and can find and can show that they're actually learning complex stuff by taking part in the space.
Can you like illustrate that with a specific example from one of the spaces, just to contextualize that for folks in terms of the limited design space but still creative?
Mm-hmm. So one of the projects, let me think of a good one. Here's sort of a fanciful one. You've got these spaces where you give kids a whole bunch of materials and you say, build what's interesting to you, but often I've found that they are not able to build very interesting stuff because they don't already know how to do computational engineering or making thinking, right? They don't know what is buildable and they don't have a sense. So I gave an example, we were just talking at lunch, one of a Studio K project that I'm working on with Kurt Squire. We've had some experiences where, there have been some experiences, and some of these other game design experiences, where people come in, they really want to build Call of Duty, right? They come in, I play lots of Call of Duty, so I should be able to build it, I really know it well. And it's hard to explain to the person who you have given all of the tools, well, yeah, you could technically build Call of Duty, but you can't really build Call of Duty, and you definitely can't build Call of Duty. That's definitely not the way to build engagement and deep thinking about complex content. But if you say, okay, we're all going to build puzzle games in this specific context, and you can make all these choices and you can make all these design decisions, but they're contextually structured design decisions around making these puzzle games, you can get a lot more engagement, and then you can say, oh, and look, and you can make those connections as you go, as you facilitate to connect the puzzle game to Call of Duty in the long run, and that's how they come to that thinking, so they understand the connections between puzzle and Call of Duty without feeling like, oh, other people can build Call of Duty, but I personally can't. I'm a bad person, or whatever.
I'll just talk about Make Shop. So, as an exhibit space that's open all the time in a children's museum, the Make Shop is really an interest-driven area where families come in, and usually it's at the will of their 2-year-old or 10-year-old where they engage and how long they engage and how they engage, and so or how they begin to engage at least. And so we really honored that interest-driven experience, and we very rarely say this is what we're making today. It's very much setting up access to and a supportive environment for experimentation and just opportunity to explore materials, tools, and processes, and then to engage in the having of ideas and then making of things. The ways in which instruction comes into play is through facilitation, which is very much inquiry-driven. We ask a lot of questions rather than providing a lot of information. We provide information when the opportunity arises. We encourage kids to take chances, persist, to fail a little bit and try again. We work to notice connections that are happening from experiences that happen that parents reference from home or from other contexts. And we like to position family members in interesting ways, thinking about everybody as learners and everybody as teachers. And that includes, adults, facilitators, and children. And so that's really the way in which we think about instruction versus interest.
Thank you.
each of us has sort of addressed this from the perspective of the participants of our program, the main participants, the youth in general. I just want to say something about the adults in the room. One of the things we found is that there's a sense of empowerment and relief that we see among the adults who get to coach and guide kids in this alternative way, rather than to kind of keep a stable of 30 kids going in the same direction at the same time. That's been true both of the people who are staffing this in libraries and the regular classroom teachers who are doing this after school. So it's refreshing for them as well.
Do you want to just say one more thing about some of the difficulties that some of those adults have had in terms of releasing the instructional mindset?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably expected by everyone in the room. If that's the way you've been a teacher for most of your career, it's hard to give that up. So we try to help them, and the folks in the sixth row have been doing a lot to help them do that. But what I do find is that once they get there, it feels more like teaching to them than what they were doing before.
Any last comments on that before we move on the instruction versus self-direction tensions in your space?
It can be very uncomfortable for adults to, teachers, parents, to not know an outcome or not know the endpoint of an activity, and that's something that we really not struggle with, but is definitely a challenge in our space, is convincing and coaxing to just sort of let the learning experience go. And I know that there is interesting learning happening, but to just notice it as it's happening rather than go towards a specific endpoint.
Yeah, so that's a great point, and I think we'll come back to that at the end about trying to get a handle on what it means to do that and how more traditional environments would have difficulty.
So Reed said that the teachers and the facilitators often sort of come with this instructionist mindset. But the students do too, which makes it, I mean, I've taught programming N times, you know, and I've taught making and I've taught building. And the students, especially the more creative the project, the more frustrated the students, and there are these flow issues and there are these building issues. You definitely always have kids who are ready to jump in and they're willing to push through this stuff. But one of the things that's inherent in this instruction versus self-direction versus collaborative direction or whatever is finding ways to structure the social space, finding ways to structure the building space, finding ways to enable flow and minimize bad frustration and enable good frustration. And being okay with people really deeply hating what they're working on. Finding ways, I mean, I was programming just yesterday and I really deeply hated what I was programming for about a half hour, and then I was back okay again, right? And there has to be that space, and you have to build into your space this understanding, if we're not coming from an instructionist perspective, that this frustration is going to be on you and you're going to feel bad.
Yeah, just to pick up on that. And what you just said is absolutely something we agree with. And that's one of the reasons we ended up with this level challenge sequence approach, because kids are not, I mean, most of my career has been about trying to cultivate open-ended design stuff, and the very same thing you just described happened. So the compromise we made was to give them a structure in which to climb.
Yeah, it does seem like both the adults and the kids often have this detox period when they come into a space like that, where they have to sort of unlearn a lot of the socialization structures, and you know, going through that withdrawal, you know, the shakes and the cold sweats, and so they come out on the other side and they're feeling better. So
There's this sort of inherent value, and so the Sector 67, which Brianne mentioned, does have a sort of LPP, a legitimate peripheral participation model at some level. They really do have Gopher kids doing Gopher stuff and feeling like legitimate parts of these projects. And even that is frustrating. But it's great because now you have a person that if you don't go for this thing for your laser cutter, we're out of laser cutter time, that Arduino is going to beep, and then we're done for the day. And just having that sort of be the mode of Sector 67, I think enables high school students who wouldn't normally take part in this stuff to take part in this stuff because they're mutually beholden to each other.
Yeah, that's great. All right, so let's, this was great, I probably could talk about this the whole time, but let's move on to the second kind of issue that came up a number of times in some of the opening statements, especially around this idea of art versus engineering. Reed put it on his first slide, the taking STEAM to the next level, STEAM exploration to the next level. So there is this sense of STEAM integrating the arts and design with engineering, and also the complexities around sort of evaluating or assessing what those practices look like. So why don't we talk about how each of your spaces is addressing that, or what the balance or mix tends to look like, and is there an emphasis on one versus the other as you put the program together?
So at Sector 67, which is where I've spent most of my time, they have a very real tension of this, just the space itself. What materials are gonna be easily accessible, and when they got the laser cutter, it took over the art space. So there's been like this contention going on that level, just among the makerspace members themselves, of do we want this to be an art space? How do we want sort of this identity of balancing those two those boundaries and trying to figure out how they see themselves. And then on our level as researchers, we've really struggled with this, especially coming from, given that sector is pretty heavily engineering driven right now because it was founded by an engineer, but they are trying to bring a more arts-based approach to this making. And one way that we've done that is through, or attempted to do that, as I showed, the audio was kind of muffled, though, I think, in the speakers, but was through the challenge-based approach that we've done to, we're still experimenting with prompts and what the best way to word these things are. So at Sector, as you saw, the result of create flow, or make something that captures your idea of flow, resulted immediately into water and immediately into this sort of perpetuating machine that would continuously flow. Whereas even at Make Shop, we did the same experiment the same week, and they had a variety of results come out, projects come out of, I think there was video remix, and then there was a couple of engineering things. So there's a wider range. And the difference is, we haven't spent a whole lot of time talking about this yet, but the difference, the immediate difference, is the materials available to them in order to help solve these problems.
As well as the individual versus group approach to it,
Yep.
that was something else that was different and kind of interesting.
Yeah. So, and that's what I was trying to show in the video. I don't think that you could hear the audio, but they were having this conversation at the beginning of, do we do this individually or do we do this as a group? And they decided to do it as a group, and they immediately were talking about, you're engineers, let's bring in your expertise. You have a PhD in mechanical this, and they were immediately going with what they knew. So that's how we've sort of been grappling with this tension.
I would say, at least as we look at our participants in activity, this isn't a big tension for them. They're doing what kids are doing. They're trying to solve a problem, complete a challenge, make something. And almost always there's both aesthetic and functional criterion that they're trying to respond to. But it is an issue because society has a great divide between art and engineering. And in schools, we value one as productive and contributing to society, and the other one we treat as more or less a hobby. And there's something wrong with that. And certainly, if you look down to my right, you see one company's boxes dominating all the other companies' boxes, and that's not because they have better technology or better engineering inside. It's because of their aesthetics. And so we're pushing seriously on the STEAM idea, And I think we have some distance to go in the sense that most of our challenges, the criteria we have for completion are still mostly functional. And there's a reason for that, because it's a little easier to, say, build a spaghetti structure and demonstrate that it's 4 feet tall than it is to demonstrate that it has, multilateral symmetry and is beautiful to someone's eye. That takes human judgment and other things, but we're headed in that direction. Art, either one.
Well, it's interesting you bring up aesthetics, so I want to jump in here, because this is something that concerns us a lot too. I mean, you look at a lot of the activities that end up showing up in a lot of these maker spaces, and what distinguishes them from crafts, right? But at the same time, we have this mission where, I'm sure you all are familiar with the idea of designing activities, educational activities that have high ceilings and wide walls, and we have a responsibility to have things like very low floors as well. So how do you engage people who don't already self-identify as makers, for example? And the aesthetic piece of it is a really great way to get people engaged. People really latch onto aesthetics. And I think the key there is to make sure that the aesthetic piece of it is consequential. It has meaning. The choices that you make, the design choices that were made by this particular manufacturer to our right, had consequences that could be evaluated. And I think that providing a context that allows the makers, the young makers, to see that in action, to see the power of consequence, is just as important as giving them the sort of requisite skills to do the building itself.
I think that's exactly it. And I think also that there's this sort of feature that one of the things that I worry about and I think a lot about is I want people to be able to think and consider things in new ways. I don't want them to just have a blinky thing at the end of the day, right? Blinky things are fun, but the thing that I want is that they can now perceive things they couldn't perceive before. They can think in new ways that they couldn't think before. And if that isn't art, then I'm not going to go on that tangent. But it's ironic because I was actually taught engineering as an art. The way that I was taught software engineering in particular was that we were making games, we were making visuals, we were making beautiful things, and then they said, okay, go take this and then go work for an insurance company building databases, right? And but I couldn't do that actually. That wasn't where I went with it. But part of it is that engineering is an art. Engineering is making things. Computer science is making things. And the maker movement is about making things that aren't necessarily just purely functional, making things that mean something to you, right? And that's what we're doing here, and that's why this is, from my perspective, but this is one of the great things that we're doing here is that we're thinking about engineering and computer science and these kinds of things as a way of engineering art and arting engineering, and I think that could not be more important, and that's the connection that we're making.
I guess I wanted just to ask for a little bit of elaboration on that. Reed, I think, brought it up, and then David or Matthew, you came back to it again, as well as some of the other panelists, around this idea that often the design or aesthetic elements are something that have to be trained or developed, that you want to move people from where they come into being able to understand something in a different way or critique it potentially in a more sophisticated way. And that, obviously, that kind of structuring and scaffolding then gets us closer back towards some of the engineering work. So is there anybody who has thought about how those get supported or interleaved in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I'm going to take this back. I've been working at Studio KLL lately, which is my recent project at GLS. And we're actually teaching people to build things, to program games, and to sort of construct games and prototype games in concert with learning to program and learning to build things. So they're all one, and we're really taking the game design aspect. Is Megan here? She's somewhere. Hi, Megan. I'm speaking. I'll say nice things about you, but we're really thinking. We're really thinking hard about how the design really matters. That the game design actually matters. It's not just a side. It's not a trick to get people to program. That the key in thinking about these things, there are multiple different ways that you can come at the aesthetics. And I think that really structuring it around both the aesthetics of game design and the way that you engineer are almost inseparable in some way when you're thinking about pushing this stuff further.
So why don't we, the media's topic is ahead of us, and so I want to spend maybe the next 10 minutes trying to address that, and then we'll leave about 10 minutes for some Q&A with the audience and the panel. So the last one, I think, is really a challenging one in terms of thinking about what the qualities or capacities that we're seeing being developed or nurtured in individuals or groups in your spaces. And how are you thinking about documenting them, or maybe you can use the word assessing them as you go through? Because this is, again, a little bit more of a Wild West area than formal education typically is. And then with respect to that, with what you're seeing in terms of those capacities, how do they contrast with the kinds of things that we would normally see being developed in more formal STEM learning environments?
I can start. For most of my career, I've been documenting the perverse aspects of STEM environments that make kids risk-averse and make them give up before they even try or even know what they're trying at. And I think of everything that I'd like to demonstrate in the FUSE project and like to see in this larger movement is the idea that you can try and you can, quote, fail. As we like to say in FUSE, failure is just another try. But in school, failure counts. I have a 6th grade daughter. This last week, I've been experiencing failure counting in a way I don't ever want to relive, but I know I'm probably going to relive it next week because she left something off a rubric, got 0 out of 20 points for something, and it destroyed her weekend. Did she forget to read a piece of paper? And yeah, she did. But should she have been given another shot? Should that be built into the structure of the experience? Of course it should be. And that's what we've been trying to do in FUSE. And so for me, probably the most valuable outcome, and we're trying to learn to document this, is kids who persist, try again. When they try something and it doesn't work, they try something different, and they get rewarded for trying something different and ultimately succeeding with that something different. So I think of, I could say a lot of other things. We want kids to be connecting with each other. We want them to be learning from each other. But if there's one individual capacity that I think that STEM education does disastrously, it's that. And the last thing I'll say is that, the interest-driven focus that all of these projects and almost everything at DML are focused on, I think, is a very important aspect. And for those of us who maybe don't have the argumentation for it, I think Robert Tye's work at the University of Virginia is very helpful in the sense that he's argued that a better indicator of future STEM professional activity is interest and especially out-of-school participation in STEM activities than anything you do in school. So we're not doing this just because kids like it and are interested in it. It has other meaning. So I'll stop there.
Well, so I can speak to some of the efforts that New York Hall of Science is doing in this. So one of the things that we are cooking at the moment, we are replacing one of our major exhibition galleries with what's called the Design Lab. And the goal of this space is to sort of bring making to the general visitor experience. And one of the things that's getting sort of baked into that at a very fundamental structural level is the documentation of one's creations. So the idea of documenting self-documentation of one's own work, presentation of one's own work, seeing the work of other visitors, the chaff of failures past, and successes past as well, is the thing that ties together all the different making stations within this exhibition space. So we're really hoping that by making this practice the unifying feature of our exhibition gallery, that not only will the visitors have a better time, they'll be inspired by seeing things that other people have tried. They'll be inspired by the fact that they see that other people have failed, or at least encouraged, I suppose, perhaps inspired. But also we have the secret benefit of then being able to use that information to further our understanding, which I think was the original question, how we're going to document the progress people are making with this. So we're hoping to see that people will be reappropriating each other's ideas in interesting ways and charting that process over time in their business.
Yeah, I agree with you guys entirely. This isn't a very contentious panel. We should just, we're all on the same team here. But the point of assessment, there's 2 points to assessment, right? So I'm a learning scientist. I think about how learning works at some level. But one of the big points of assessment is that kids can build, kids, whoever, can build better in the future. They can make more of how they want to make and what they want to make, and they can use that information they're getting assessed by. Someone giving you 0 out of 20 because that's awful, obviously. That's just terrible. And it's so non-informational. I mean, that's the killer, right? If it were informational in any way, it would be terrible, but maybe there was some way that you could learn from it. But it's just punitive, and assessment is punishment. It's just ridiculous, right? We know that that's just wrong. So the key is finding ways to assess that give information and help and guidance back to the person who's making. Debugging is assessment, right? Working out the kinks in your constructions is a form of assessment, and thinking deeper about how we can give back this information. So one of other projects I work on, I do a lot of learning analytics. Thinking not about how we can provide the instructor with ways to better fail out students when they have tons of data, but literally how we can give information back to the builders about what's going right and what's going right and what's going wrong and how and what they're trying to build. And doing that in a moment-by-moment basis, enabling better tinkering, like enabling people to know what's going wrong at a minute, micro level with the way that they're thinking about how they're building their structure, their fiddly bits, their linky things, etc. And then also enabling this not only at the sort of learning analytics level, and maybe connected also, but at the social level. And I've said this a couple times, but really thinking about how you can build these social structures, like using LPP. I mean, it's sort of old school, I guess, to keep bringing up LPP, but really thinking about how you can have people who are more central participants who really think about how the more peripheral participants are using and building, and how they can provide meaningful feedback on what's going right and what's going wrong with the people who are more on the periphery. Finding ways to formalize that, and in this case, also using things like learning analytics or data mining or whatever, to really formalize the ways that people can communicate about what's going right and wrong with their projects to each other. The side benefit also is that you can use these semi-fancy tools to convince people who are not us, to show them that we're not us. That you can convince them that people are now able to build things that they weren't able to build before in ways they weren't able to build before, because we have the hard facts of what they were doing on a moment-by-moment basis. We can see what kinds of things are going more right for them. And that can be convincing to people who really don't fundamentally believe at their heart that the important thing is the kids are making stuff, which is, I think, what I believe.
So making happens in the space, like in the maker spaces that we're working in, and hacker spaces, in a really like collaborative and emerging way that isn't necessarily present in a lot of formal environments. And so, but we're still concerned, even in research, about individual trajectories. And so we've been really grappling with this tension between, like at Sector 67 in their experiment, it was I asked them afterwards, like, why did you guys choose to work together? And they were like, well, it's natural in this space. It would be weird for us to work on ourselves. So how do we allow these interactions to happen while still assessing these individual trajectories? One of the ways that we started exploring is what Erica Halverson and Kim Sheridan are calling like Reggio's style of approach of like documenting the entire process. So rather than looking at the final product, piecing together sort of this, like we started in this video with the sketch that they had, and moving to the final product, and rather than just looking at the final product, sort of literally documenting the entire conversation around it, and all of the making and iteration that happens. On that same end, sort of encouraging this iterative process, design process to happen using the digital, like asynchronous critique method and reflection of constantly going through these cycles and making this better, and where the final state is less clear, and it's more about sort of, I think, what you're talking about, Matthew, like constantly just making things better and passing it off and making things better and building on it, and it's less about the finished state.
And we'll talk about this more in the next session, so stay tuned. But some of the things that I think is really important in our contest, the contexts that we're thinking about as far as individuals and groups are not only the development of skills and fluency, which I think are really an important aspect of this learning, but also things like, as people talk about, the relational and dispositional qualities and how those are changing, and the ways in which a family learning experience shifts the way a parent might think about their child, or the way the child might think about themselves, or the way the parent might think about themselves. The intentionality with which someone engages in learning, I think is something that we've talked a lot about. Another really important quality, I think, to the work is that it carries across context, that it's not in one space, and we see that a lot happening quite a bit in our spaces, and we'll talk more about it in a little bit, but the ways in which, the idea might start at home, the process might carry through the museum experience, and then it comes back to the museum through home again. Just that I think is really important.
So Layla mentioned self-documentation, and Reed, I know that you said something very quickly at the beginning in your intro about that, but I was wondering if you wanted to kind of elaborate on how that, very concretely, how that works and what it looks like.
Sure, and just maybe, Matt said we didn't have any disagreements, so maybe if I can stir one up a little bit then. I think there's a difference between a sort of an externalist and an internalist view of assessment, and I think you were talking about both kinds. And I think we ought to stay suspicious of the external kind of assessment. Internal can be an LPP, people in your community helping you learn things. But when you step outside and there's a homogeneous, uniform rubric that applies to everyone, that's not contextual, that's not situational, then it's a different animal. And that's what psychometricians have been busy building for a really long time, and it does the job they want it to do. But it doesn't do the job you want it to do, which is formative assessment. The other thing to say there is at a certain point, people get to be adults, they get to decide whether they've got something done on their own, they get to document their own successes. So one of the things we're leveraging here is the idea that people document their own successes and then submit it to a community of people to say, we've done this, check it if you want, but trust us that we've done it.
I actually don't disagree, I fully agree. All right. So I want to thank the panel for that spirited discussion. We've got about 6 or 7 minutes left, and so I want to take the opportunity to open the floor up. There's a mic if you don't want to shout.